The Eastern Empire lasted until Constantinople fell at the hands of the Islamic invaders in 1453. Montesquieu wants to tell us that the Eastern Empire lasted for a long time because of several systematic reasons. This is how he begins chapter 23, the last of the chapters in the book. The Eastern Empire lasted for a long time because the Arabs, who presented a great threat, were divided or weakened or no longer had their zeal for conquest. Because the Easterners could protect themselves with technology from naval assault. Because the barbarians that lived over in the area had to settle down and were no longer so frightening. And because, as Montesquieu says at the beginning of chapter 20, the barbarian invaders looked at the place of the Eastern Empire and decided that the West would be easier to conquer. Montesquieu never traces these reasons as to why the Eastern Empire lasted so long to the decisions of its statesmen. Decisions like the decision of Theodosius to build the walls around Constantinople, or like the decision of Constantine to build a city in a place easily protected, or to determine the actions of statesmen like Justinian, who did much to reunite the Roman Empire, if only for a time. This is very much in keeping with the denial of such things as statesmanship in Montesquieu's treatment. It is very much in line with his general sociological view. But it means that this treatment of the Eastern Empire seems both radically incomplete and to do more than a little injustice to the people who ruled the kingdom. Montesquieu conducts a species of experiment, comparing an empire with Christianity with an empire without Christianity, or the Roman Empire in the beginning with the Roman or Greek or Eastern Empire that began around 500. Let us see the result of this experiment. The Eastern Empire is a dumpster fire in Montesquieu's view, supported only by the idea that it's surrounded by bigger smelling, worse dumpster fires. First, a little bit of history is in order. The year was approximately 525 when Justinian the Great rose to power in the East. Barbarians controlled most of what would be considered the Western Roman Empire. Vandals controlled North Africa, including places like Carthage. The Goths controlled Spain and Italy. Justinian's ambition was to conquer the western parts of the empire and restore a united Roman Empire. He did this through the service of his very competent general Belisarius. Belisarius first captured the Vandals of North Africa. Then he came home to Constantinople, where he was greeted with what is probably the world's last triumph, hosted by Justinian. And then he was sent to conquer Italy from the Goths, which he also did. By around 550, this reunification of the Roman Empire, such as it was complete, as can be seen on this map, kind of. There was a series of falling outs between Justinian and Belisarius, as Justinian became quite jealous of Belisarius's accomplishments, and especially Justinian's wife, the famed Theodora, became jealous on her husband's behalf. For Belisarius, Montesquieu has great praise, and he seems to consider Belisarius the last true Roman. The main reasons for his successes can be found in the qualities of this great man, with a general who followed all the maxims of the early Romans and an army much like the old Roman armies were formed. Montesquieu calls the campaigns of Belisarius a very bold enterprise. Just as Julian the Apostate was reminiscent of the old ways, so Belisarius was a reminder of these old ways. These old ways are familiar to us. The Romans were willing to interpret all treaties in their own favor and to break faith when needed in order to secure their interests. Speaking of Belisarius, Montesquieu says that he first allied himself with the Goths in Sicily so that he could attack the Vandals in Africa, and later began his assault on Italy by attacking Sicily. Like those early Romans, Belisarius returned from his conquest with captives and kings and loot. And somewhat like the early Romans, Belisarius was given a triumph, but only after he conquered Africa. I also want to say that just as the early Romans had Egyptians and Syrians and Carthaginians as their not altogether difficult competition, Belisarius had barbarians who were forced to settle down as his competition. And the Vandals were, as Montesquieu writes, languishing in sensual pleasures, dandies, effeminate clothes, baths, and so on. In contrast to Belisarius stands Justinian, just as in contrast to Julian the Apostate stood the stupid Constantine of Montesquieu's imagination. Both Constantine and Justinian were thought great, but neither deserved it. What kinds of things did Justinian do? First, Montesquieu describes his character, his misconduct, his prodigality, harassment and plundering, his passion for building, changing, and reforming, the inconstancy of his design, his severity and weakness in his reign made him more disagreeable by a protracted age. Second, Justinian took sides in a factional dispute between the blues and the greens, and such factional disputes often prove fatal to imperial rule. Third, one would have thought Justinian would get credit for his legal reforms, which Hume and even Montesquieu praised for contributing to the rise of the rule of law in Europe. But Montesquieu complains that Justinian made too many changes in jurisprudence in too short a time. And Montesquieu seems to suggest that Justinian was on the take, taking bribes and selling his judgments to the highest bidder. It is here I want you to go back and remember the praise of Constantine from Lars Brownworth from the podcast last time. A very different view. Fourth, and most importantly, is the political harm that Justinian caused on religious matters. But what did the most harm to the political condition of the government was his scheme for reducing all men to the same opinion in matters of religion, in circumstances which made his zeal entirely indiscreet. Just as the old Romans strengthened their empire by permitting every kind of religion in it, so was it subsequently reduced to nothing by amputating, one after the other, the sects which were not dominant. Justinian betrays a zeal in religion and an intolerance that really make up for the disorders of the Eastern Empire that Montesquieu catalogues in chapter 21. Heresies would be punished by the political arm. The sanctity of princes was undermined. In chapter 22, he says that a universal bigotry numbed the spirit and enervated the whole empire. Faint-heartedness, laziness, and indolence blended with religious devotion. There were quarrels about icons and magic, and what to do with people who practiced magic, and what to do with people who prayed with icons. These are the silly stuff of state that existed in the Eastern Empire. It is strange that these things arose in the Eastern Empire, because the Eastern Empire took seriously the doctrine of the separation of church and state, but they had a very difficult time accomplishing it. This is what Montesquieu says. The ministers of religion among the early Romans were not excluded from the burdens of civil society, and hardly got involved in its affairs. When the Christian religion was established, the ecclesiastics, who were more removed from worldly affairs, concerned themselves with them to a moderate extent. But when, in the decline of the empire, the monks were the only clergy, these men, destined by a more particular doctrine about how to flee and fear worldly affairs, seized every occasion to take part in them. They never stopped making a stir everywhere and agitating the world they had quitted. Everywhere in the Eastern Empire, political power ended up resolving theological disputes. The reason the Eastern Empire hung on so long, if Montesquieu is to be believed, was a paltry competition, not its intrinsic strength or institutions. Montesquieu notes in chapter 22 the incredible weakness of the Greeks before the advances of Islam, the religion, quote, religion and empire of Muhammad founded with the same hand. Survival does not necessarily mean great strength. The Eastern Empire could just have been the tallest midget. But this confrontation with Islam contains the beginnings of an analysis about the church and state. Whereas Christianity fundamentally distinguishes the world and heaven and denigrates the former in favor of the latter, Islam and the early Roman Church fused the two. This by no means means that Montesquieu finds Islam and the pagan religions to be equally good for politics. And his earlier book, The Persian Letters, partly concerns the disaster Islam makes for politics. But it does not mean that the separation is sewn into the nature of Christianity and that causes problems for the country that would be founded on love of the soil. Could a separation between the world and politics on the one hand and heaven and religion on the other be made fit for political power in other circumstances? For that, we will need a bit more data. But the fundamental problem was simply the attitude toward politics, which accounts, as the chapter 22 makes clear, for the weakness of the Eastern Empire. Consider the interesting quotation alluding to Pascal near the beginning of chapter 22. Religion and empires prosper in different ways. The celebrated author said that he was quite content to be sick, because sickness is a Christian's true condition. Similarly, one could say that the humiliations of the church, its dispersion, the destruction of its temples, the suffering of its martyrs, are the occasions of its glory, and that when in the eyes of the world it appears to be triumphant, the time of degradation is usually at hand. In this, it seems, the church is no different from a political community. As Montesquieu has told the story, Rome died of its successes that were traceable to its virtues. So this might also happen to churches. Regardless, it is this attitude toward the world that ends up being the problem. Thus, considerations on the Romans ends with this fundamental, full frontal assault on Christianity as it manifests itself in the Eastern Church and state. Is this the representative form of Christianity? What is the preferred mode of politics? The early Roman? The barbarian? The Eastern Christian? Tune into the next video when we pull together these loose ends and end our consideration of Montesquieu's considerations.